You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is the first episode of season 9. Thank you so much for listening. I want to begin season 9 by talking about the very fraught topic of sexuality. Sexuality in general, I think, is an emotionally charged topic. But when you are talking about sexuality for people with a history of trauma, you are stepping into terrain that is filled with a lot of tension. But that's what we're going to do today. And I want to start with a piece of my own story regarding sexuality. When I was 35 years old, mid 30s, if you had asked me, were you sexually abused, Adam? I would have responded with a resounding no, of course not. Of course not. That would have been my immediate answer. I wouldn't have thought twice about it. However, my life was very painful. In other words, I had symptoms, fear, anxiety, dread, depression. My nervous system was frequently dysregulated, which made relationships difficult. When you experience symptoms like these, whatever your symptoms are, and you don't think that you have a story that can account for the symptoms, you will sometimes feel crazy. And I certainly did. I felt like there was something drastically wrong with me. Why? Why? Because I had all these emotional problems and there was no explanation for them. There was no way to account for them. And around that age, mid 30s, someone gave me a copy of the book The Wounded Heart by Dan Allender. Now, I don't I don't know why I started reading the book because the book has a subtitle. And the subtitle is Hope for Adult Victims of Childhood Sexual Abuse. And I had not been sexually abused. So I don't know why I began reading it. I can't explain that. But as soon as I began reading, I found myself in the pages. I had never read a book that more accurately depicted the landscape of my heart like this book did. However, all of the talk about sexual abuse was grating. All right. It annoyed me. So, in order to get through the book, I had to take a black Sharpie magic marker. And every time I came across the word sexual, when it said sexual abuse, I would cross out the word sexual. I would use that black Sharpie. I would cross that word sexual out. That way, the sentence would just refer to abuse, not sexual abuse. And I knew that I had experienced physical, emotional, verbal abuse from my father. So that's how I got through the book. Now, after finishing reading The Wounded Heart, I heard about a week-long group experience that Dan Allender ran out in Seattle called Recovery Week. So I flew to Seattle to be with this man, the author of the book that had so significantly affected my life and had finally given me words for my internal experience. Now, there were 10 men at my recovery week. We were placed into two groups. And in your group, each man was given, 25 minutes to tell his story. So I did, and I spent 23 and a half minutes of my 25 talking about the abuse from my dad, the emotional, the verbal, the physical harm. Then I used the last, we'll say 90 seconds to say some version of the following. I said, look, I also had a mother, of course. We were pretty close. We were the two most emotional members of our family, and we always had a pretty close emotional bond. And I guess that in some ways you could say I was my mom's surrogate spouse because my dad was really checked out of their marriage and mom and I were really close. And that was my story. Now, when I was done speaking, Dan said to the group, does anyone have any questions for Adam? Which irritated me. Okay, Dan's words irritated me, to put it lightly. Why? Because I had not flown 3,000 miles across the country to hear from other men who were just as lost and confused as I was. I only wanted to hear from Dan. One of the men in my group responded to Dan's invitation by asking me a simple question. He just said, do you think your father was jealous of your relationship with your mother. And my response to this man was to blow him off. I just dismissively said, yeah, I don't know, sure, I guess. And then came the moment that changed my life. Dan looked at me, he leaned forward in his chair a little bit, and he simply said, "Do you really want that to be your answer?" And I can't explain what happened next except to say that a shudder went through my body. Dan was inviting me to see something that I had been unaware of for 35 years. And that moment changed my life. To this day, that's 16 years ago, I date my life before and after that sentence. That was the beginning of naming that my mother's relationship with me included sexual harm. Now, my earliest memories of sexuality occurred when I was 6 years old. Here's a little bit more of my story. 6 years old, I remember lying on my bed at night and I would fantasize about Mrs. Heidenreich and Mrs. McPherson. They were the mothers of two of my friends. Mrs. Heidenreich lived directly across the street, and Mrs. McPherson lived four doors down on the same side of the street. Now, as a 6-year-old, I had very little knowledge of the mechanics of sex. Therefore, the fantasies did not involve sexual intercourse. However, please, they were decidedly sexual fantasies. I would imagine myself sitting up in bed next to Mrs. McPherson and leaning over and kissing her goodnight. And believe me, it was heavenly. This fantasy soothed me to sleep many, many nights. I was also 6 years old the first time I let myself express sexual desire to an actual person. How did I do this? Well, one day I nervously dialed Mrs. Heidenreich's phone number. I remember sitting right next to our piano, taking our rotary phone, dialing her number. And when Mrs. Heidenreich answered the phone, I quickly spoke into the receiver, "I love you," and I hung up. My 6-year-old heart was pounding, but I did it. I told Mrs. Heidenreich that I loved her, and warm electric feelings of arousal pulsed through my body. Now, look, why am why am I telling you about my sexual fantasies as a 6-year-old? Why am I telling you about a portion of my story that lasted 30 seconds, 60 seconds tops? Because these seemingly insignificant anecdotes are actually precious pieces of data. And taken together, these stories that I'm sharing hint at the reality of what had happened to that young boy by the age of 6. Exploring your story is a lot like detective work. Okay, detectives collect sufficient data so that they can piece together the scene of a crime. The data that they collect tell the truth about what really happened, what went down. Now, similarly, exploring your story is about mining your memory for clues about what really happened to you as a boy or a girl. And when you collect the clues, when you collect the data points, they will tell the truth of the story of your life. Now, initially, as you can imagine, my memories of having sexual fantasies about Mrs. Heidenreich and Mrs. McPherson, those memories held immense shame for me. Oh my goodness. What kind of 6-year-old does that? Is what I thought to myself. However, today, these memories are as sacred as they are precious to me. Why? Because they tell the truth about what had happened to me. As ironic as this might sound, here is an axiom of story work. The memories that hold the deepest shame for you will be the very memories that can set you free. Let me say it again. The memories that hold the deepest shame for you will be the very memories that can set you free. What kind of 6-year-old has sexual fantasies about two mothers on the street? This is actually an excellent question, if it is allowed to be a question. However, for me, it was an accusation. Until I was willing to ponder it as a question, I couldn't uncover the truth of my story. What kind of 6-year-old has sexual fantasies about other moms? The kind of 6-year-old who has been repeatedly sexualized and aroused by his own mother. Now, look, you, like me, have also borne the weight of accusations. Behind each experience in your life of shame, each experience of shame is an accusation. What if the accusations that haunt you can become questions that you explore with curiosity and with kindness? One more time. What if the accusations that haunt you, the accusations that come against you in your day-to-day life, what if those can become questions that you explore with both curiosity and some measure of kindness? As a senior in high school, some of my classmates dated girls who were sophomores, a common practice, right? Nothing that far out of the ordinary. But I remember thinking to myself, who in the world would date someone younger than them? I mean, it made no sense to me. I had no arousal for girls who were younger than me, utterly uninterested in them. Why? Why? Because my brain had been conditioned to be aroused by older women like my mother, not younger women or girls. Human beings are aroused by particular things in the present because of our experience of being aroused by particular things in the past. Let me say it again. We are aroused by things today because of our experiences of being aroused by those things in the past. Like, look, have you not noticed that not everyone is turned on by the same things? People are aroused by different things. And there is a reason for this. Your past story can help you understand why you are turned on by the things that turn you on. Your sexual preferences, your sexual fantasies are not random. Jay Stringer wrote a book called Unwanted, and in that book, he points out that when it comes to your sexual story, there are always two storylines at play. There's the storyline of your present sexual struggles, your present sexual experiences. That's number one. But then there's also the storyline of your growing up experiences, which set you up for those present sexual struggles. In the language of Isaiah, from Isaiah 61, there is the storyline of your present captivities, and there is the storyline of where your heart was broken as a boy or girl by harmful sexual experiences. Jay and Isaiah are saying the same thing. Two storylines at play. In the language of Isaiah, it is your present captivities, and then it is the story of your brokenheartedness from the past. There is always a linkage between your wounding and your bondage, captivity, stuckness. There is a connection between your painful experiences growing up and your present sexual struggles, your present sexual life, your present sexual heartache. Take any present day sexual issue, okay? Previous scenes from your story will illuminate the origins of that present sexual issue. Sexual harm from the past becomes reenacted in the present. Why? Because you have neurons. And that's how neurons operate. You have a brain. Your brain is fundamentally about anticipating. Your brain is an anticipation machine. What does that mean? It means it operates on the basis of priming. Priming is simply a fancy word which means that your brain anticipates what is going to happen this afternoon based on past experiences. What if, here's the point, what if you became curious about what arouses you? What if you brought some genuine curiosity to the specific ways in which your present sexual struggles may have grown out of past sexual harm? For example, let me just give a simple general example. There's no such thing as someone who struggles with pornography, in quotes. No such thing. You struggle with particular kinds of pornography. In other words, you are aroused by this type of person doing this particular thing. And likewise, you are not aroused by that type of person doing that particular thing. Can you, look, for the love, can you bring some curiosity to why you are aroused by this and not that? Answering these types of questions will introduce you to parts of your sexual story that you may not be aware of yet. What I'm trying to say is perhaps there is a method to the madness. Perhaps there is a very reasonable explanation as to why your sexuality plays out the way that it does. If you're married, it is highly likely that you fight with your spouse about sex, and/or it's highly likely that sex is just more complicated, feels more complicated than it should be. What if these fights or complications are best understood as the inevitable conflict between your childhood story and your partner's childhood story? And what if understanding your family of origin story can help you make sense of the madness in your romantic relationship? Like, wouldn't that be helpful? Virtually no one makes it to adulthood without experiencing some form of sexual harm. Why? Like, why is that? Well, in my opinion, it's because God absolutely loves sex. And as a result, the kingdom of evil, the kingdom that opposes God, despises your sexuality, and to be more specific, your sexual pleasure. So to say it a slightly different way, your sexual pleasure, your sexual vitality, your sexuality has been strategically assaulted so that your sexual freedom and pleasure will be diminished. So it will be fraught. So it will be a struggle. So it will be filled with heartache, with disappointment. The primary way that evil assaults your sexuality is through the introduction of sexual shame. Shame is the bodily sense that there's something wrong with me, and therefore that I am undesirable to others. That's what shame is. It's the bodily sense that there's something wrong with me, and therefore that I'm not going to be wanted, welcomed, enjoyed by others. Sexual shame creates the internal sense of, if others knew X about me, they would not want to be in relationship with me. If they knew this about me, they wouldn't want to be in relationship with me anymore. So question, what sexual shame do you carry? Do you have any sexual desires or fantasies that you're ashamed of? And how long Have you felt ashamed of those desires, longings, fantasies? There is no way to engage your past sexual story without entering terrain that is replete with shame, confusion, and some measure of harm. And likewise, there's no way to engage your present sexual story without entering terrain that is replete with unmet longing, a deep disappointment, and a war with hope. The invitation to explore your sexual story is an invitation to go where angels fear to tread. However, if God intends for you to experience overflowing sexual pleasure and lavish sexual freedom, which God does, then exploring your sexual story is more than worth it. More than worth it. So, here are some questions to begin with. You might want to journal about your answers to the following sequence of questions. First, how did you come to learn about sex? Was your introduction to the whole realm of sexuality via television, movies, older kids in the neighborhood talking about it? Was it via pornography? Was it via a health class at school? And how did you come to know what sex and sexuality were about? Second, did your parents ever give you the quote unquote sex talk? And if so, what was that like for you? Was that a good experience? Was it a bad experience? Was it a that never happened to me experience, i.e., a non experience? Next, for you females, what is the story around getting your period? Look, the story about getting your period matters. Who guided you through that formative coming of age experience? How did your mother respond when you got your period? Next, how did your parents respond to your developing body? What did they say or not say about your body? And then last question in this whole arena of pondering your sexual development. How'd your parents feel about your boyfriends or girlfriends? How did they feel, in other words, about you becoming a sexual being? And how and what was communicated to you? Now, just as everyone's sexual story is fraught, everyone's sexual story is also unique. So what is yours? What is yours? If you can, like maybe even pause the episode and take some time to write a one-page narrative answering either the questions that I just enumerated or the following three questions. Here's another set of questions that can be oh so very helpful. Number one, how did you first learn about sex and sexuality? Number two, how have you experienced sexual harm? Because you don't make it to adulthood without experiencing some measure of sexual harm. And number three, what specifically do you feel sexual shame about? Look, writing about those three questions will take you deeper into your story, and writing about them has the potential to bear much fruit. Everyone has experienced some form of sexual harm. However, for the remainder of this episode, I am going to talk very explicitly about sexual harm. And please know, please, and this is true for every episode that I do, you are always free to pause or stop the episode whenever you want if it gets too upsetting for you. There is nothing wrong with listening to something like this a little bit at a time. So please pay attention to your heart, to your body, and pause it or stop it if you need to. You can always come back to it later. Now, I've made the point that everyone experiences some form of sexual harm. However, sadly, for many of you, the sexual harm that you experienced is properly termed sexual abuse. And as Dan Allender points out in his landmark book, The Wounded Heart, that book that meant so much to me, sexual abuse, he says, it comes in two forms. Sexual contact is form one, and sexual interactions, form two. Now, sexual contact refers to physical touch that is intended to arouse sexual desire in either the perpetrator or the victim, or both. That's sexual contact. Sexual interactions, on the other hand, refers to sexual violations that do not involve physical touch. Now, most people are aware that inappropriate sexual contact equals sexual abuse, okay? But it can be much harder to name the violation of inappropriate sexual interactions. So I want to talk just briefly about examples of sexual interactions that are abusive. And here's a few examples. One of your parents walked through the house regularly in their underwear, or once in their underwear. In other words, you were exposed to a parent in some measure of undress. Number two, your father made comments about your developing body in your presence. He commented on your body in your presence. Number three, your mother, and these are just examples, your mother told you about her marital frustrations with your father. Sometimes maybe she even mentioned her sexual disappointment in him. And the fourth example I'll give, your father left his pornographic magazines in a place that you could find them. Whether the sexual abuse you experience falls in the category of sexual contact or sexual interactions, it's important to understand that the damage to your heart, your mind, and your body is severe. Doesn't matter which category you experience. And what is the severity? Well, the primary damage from sexual abuse can best be described in one word: complicity. Complicity. The word complicit means involved with another person in wrongdoing. Now, look, I am in no way saying that the abuse was your fault, whether it was sexual contact or sexual interactions. I'm not saying that it was your fault. However, the hard truth needs to be named. The goal of evil in sexually abusing you is to torment you with the awareness of your own complicity in the midst of the horror. Shame takes root in our heart through the bodily based knowledge that I was complicit in my own sexual abuse. What does that mean? I voluntarily participated in some way, even if it was just for a second. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean by this. When you think back on your abuse, you may feel complicit in one or all four of the following four ways. Here are four ways that you may have felt complicit. Number one, I was complicit in that I desired the kindness, the attention, the connection, the affection of the person who abused me. I desired their attention. I enjoyed being with my abuser at times. That's category one, where you may feel complicit. Category two, I was complicit in that I had some measure of choice when I went into the abusive situation and I chose to go. Now, very often, this involves the agonizing reality of receiving something good in exchange for being abused. In other words, it's the sense that I was willing to pay the price of the abuse in order to get something good from my relationship with the abuser. And that something good may have been ice cream, candy, whatever, special time, but it may just have been their affection, their care, their attunement, their connection with you. Number 3, I was complicit in that at some point during the abuse, I stopped resisting. I stopped saying no. At some point, I stopped fighting back. And number 4, I was complicit in that my body responded with some measure of arousal during the abuse. Okay, those are 4 common ways that you may have felt complicit in your abuse. In other words, you may have felt inside like you participated in some way. It is important to understand that the goal of evil, the ultimate goal of evil in violating you sexually, is to make you feel complicit. Now, why? Why is that the goal? Because once you feel complicit, high levels of shame lodge in your heart and your body. Let me flesh this out. Again, complicity refers to the knowledge that I did something to participate in the abuse. I did something. And right around the bend from that sentence is this accusation: I wanted it. If I'm honest with myself, part of me wanted it. Now, please, there is truth in the accusation, but it's not the full truth. The full truth can best be summarized this way: hell no, I didn't want to be abused. But oh, yes, I wanted the attention, the affection, the connection, the care, and the kindness that my abuser wove into our relationship. Now, I don't have time at this point to address the healing process well, but I want to at least say this. I want to at least say this for today. More than anything else, healing from sexual abuse is about blessing the goodness of your desire for attention, affection, connection, care, and kindness, while also grieving that the cost to experience these things was oh so very high. Let me say that again. When it comes to healing from sexual abuse, more than anything else, healing is about blessing the goodness of your desire for attention, affection, all that stuff that your abuser wove into your relationship through the grooming process, while at the same time grieving that the cost to experience all that goodness was so very high. Okay. Whew. Goodness. Oh, goodness. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you made it through to the end, I want to end today's podcast by announcing that I have written a book, and there's an entire chapter about exploring your sexual story. Actually, I think there's 2 chapters that goes into exploring your sexual story in much more depth. The title of the book is Make Sense of Your Story, and the subtitle is Why Engaging Your Past with Kindness Changes Everything. The book on the whole is designed to take you deeper into your own story. And if this podcast has been helpful to you, one way that you can say thank you is by pre-ordering the book. It's titled Make Sense of Your Story. You can pre-order it anywhere books are sold, or you can just go to adamyoungcounseling.com, and right there, front and center on the homepage, are pre-order links. Thank you for considering it. Have a good couple of weeks.